A lone column of soldiers wades into a freezing river at dawn. February 1779, deep in enemy territory. Their commander is already waist-deep, his face blackened with gunpowder, gesturing his men forward without a word. There is no food left. There is no way back. Only a fort 200 miles behind them and one ahead. This is George Rogers Clark, and what his starving men are about to do will help decide the size of a nation. 6 months earlier, this same man had captured a British fort without firing a single shot. Now the British had struck back, and Clark had one desperate winter left to save everything he had won. To understand how an illiterate surveyor's son pulled off one of the boldest gambles of the American Revolution, you have to go back to a quiet farm in Virginia, years before any of this began. Not because he was born a soldier, because nobody who met him as a young man would have guessed any of this was coming. This is the story of a 200-mile march through a frozen, flooded wilderness that nearly killed every man on it. A story of a stolen keelboat turned into a warship, a bluff played with borrowed flags, and a debt no one ever repaid. By the end, one man would help win an empire's worth of territory for the United States before he turned 30. And by the end of his life, his own country would let him die forgotten, broke, and half erased from memory. This is George Rogers Clark, the conqueror of the Old Northwest. George Rogers Clark was born on November 19, 1752, on a small plantation near Charlottesville, Virginia. He was the second of 10 children in a family that would send 5 sons to fight in the Revolution. His formal schooling barely went past the basics. He could read only haltingly, and his handwriting stayed rough his whole life. What he lacked in letters, he made up for outdoors. 20, he was already working as a frontier surveyor. Surveying paid well for a young man willing to walk deep into contested land nobody else wanted to map. In 1774, war broke out on the frontier. Lord Dunmore's war pitted Virginia militia against the Shawnee Nation. Clark served as a captain, and it was here he first learned what real combat in the wilderness actually cost. When the war ended, Clark didn't go home. He pushed further west into the unclaimed territory called Kentucky. Kentucky in the mid-1770s was barely a settlement, a scattering of log forts holding the line against constant raids. Clark quickly became one of its most trusted leaders, not through birthright, but because settlers simply believed he could keep them alive. He rode to Virginia and personally convinced the government to recognize Kentucky as an official county and to arm it. It worked. Clark returned west, not just with recognition, but with gunpowder Kentucky desperately needed to survive. He was not yet 25. He had no formal military training, but the frontier was about to hand him a war. His family were Anglicans of English and Scots descent, farmers, not aristocrats. Nothing about his birth marked him for greatness. By the age of 20, he had already staked his own land claims along the Ohio River, earning good money from his surveying work. The Ohio Land Company later hired him to lay out new tracts along the Kentucky River, pulling him even deeper into the frontier. He made his home in Harrodsburg, Kentucky's first permanent settlement, a cluster of cabins surrounded by nothing but wilderness and danger. Across the frontier, settlers called 1777 the year of the Bloody Sevens, and for good reason. Raids on Kentucky settlements had become constant. Families couldn't plant crops without fear of losing everything by nightfall. Behind much of the violence sat one British officer in Detroit, Lieutenant Governor Henry Hamilton. Hamilton paid native allies for American prisoners and for scalps. The frontier gave him a name of their own, the hair buyer. Whether Hamilton fully controlled what his allies did in the field was debated even then. The fear he created was not. For men like Clark, the hair buyer wasn't an abstract enemy. He was the reason their neighbors weren't coming home. Waiting for the British to come to them was a losing strategy. Someone needed to go after the source. For Clark, the argument didn't matter. Every burned cabin traced back, one way or another, to that fort in Detroit. In the fall of 1777, Clark rode east to Virginia with a plan too dangerous to say out loud. He asked Governor Patrick Henry for men and gunpowder to defend Kentucky. What he actually proposed went much further. Clark wanted to strike deep into British territory, the French towns of the Illinois country, before they could strike Kentucky first. Henry agreed, but kept the true target secret. Publicly, Clark was raising men only to garrison the Kentucky frontier. On January 2nd, 1778, Clark was commissioned a lieutenant colonel with written orders known to almost no one else. Recruiting for a mission nobody could name was brutally hard. Few men will risk their lives on blind trust alone. When Clark's flatboats finally pushed off down the Ohio River in May 1778, barely 150 men were aboard. It was a fraction of what he'd hoped for. It would have to be enough. They stopped briefly at a small island in the Ohio River, training and drilling the men before the real mission even began. Only when they were ready to move did Clark finally tell most of his men where they were really going. On June 24th, 1778, Clark's small flotilla shot the rapids at the falls of the Ohio during a total eclipse of the sun. His superstitious frontiersmen took it as an omen. Clark let them believe whatever kept their courage up. To avoid British scouts along the river, Clark hid the boats and marched the rest of the way overland. His men dressed like native hunters and walked single file, each man stepping in the last man's tracks to hide their numbers. 6 days of hard marching brought them within striking distance of Kaskaskia, a fortified French town loyal to the British Crown. On the night of July 4th, 1778, Clark's men crossed the river in silence and slipped inside the fort's walls. The French commander was asleep. Clark's men took the entire fort and town without firing a single shot. At dawn, the townspeople woke to find their fort already in enemy hands and their fate resting on a stranger's mercy. Clark made them an offer nobody expected: swear loyalty to America and keep every right of a free citizen. News that France had allied with the American cause sealed the deal. The town's loyalty shifted almost overnight. 2 days later, the nearby town of Cahokia fell just as easily, its French militia joining Clark's cause without a fight. Then Kaskaskia's own priest, Father Pierre Gibault, offered to do something remarkable: ride to Vincennes and win it over himself. Gibault succeeded. Vincennes swore allegiance to Clark, without a single American soldier ever marching there. Through August and September, Clark held councils with native tribes from as far as 500 miles away. He offered each delegation a choice: a red belt of war or a white belt of peace, and let them decide his enemy's fate for themselves. Through sheer nerve and a convincing bluff about the strength he commanded, Clark secured neutrality from tribe after tribe. He also opened friendly relations with Spanish officials across the river at St. Louis, who quietly offered him support. In a matter of weeks, and almost without bloodshed, Clark had taken control of an enormous stretch of British territory. For a moment, it looked like the impossible mission was already won. But 400 miles away in Detroit, Henry Hamilton had just learned what Clark had done. Hamilton assembled a force of British regulars, loyalist militia, and native allies, roughly 500 men, and marched south. The journey down the Maumee and Wabash rivers should have taken 20 days. Low water stretched it to nearly 80. Hamilton finally reached Vincennes on December 17, 1778. The small American garrison surrendered almost immediately. With the town back in British hands, Hamilton made a decision that would cost him everything. He chose to wait for spring. His reasoning was simple. The surrounding country was flooded for miles. No army could possibly march through it in winter. He planned to rebuild his strength through the cold months, then crush Clark's small force once the ground finally dried. Hamilton complained bitterly about the French militia forced to serve alongside him, distrusting men he considered rebels at heart. It was a reasonable plan. It assumed George Rogers Clark would behave reasonably. Clark's officers laid out the grim arithmetic. By spring, Hamilton would have over 500 men. Clark had barely 200. Wait for spring, and Kentucky would almost certainly fall. There would be no second chance to stop it. So Clark proposed something no professional soldier would recommend: march on Vincennes now, in the dead of winter, before Hamilton expected it. The plan depended entirely on one thing: Hamilton would never suspect that anyone would attempt a winter crossing of that flooded ground. There was no way to haul heavy cannon overland through that terrain. So Clark improvised an entirely different solution. He bought an old keelboat, armed it with 2 small cannons, and gave it a name: the Willing. 40-some men under his cousin, Captain John Rogers, would sail it the long way around down the Mississippi up the Ohio, up the Wabash. It was supposed to meet Clark's marching column near Vincennes at exactly the right moment. Nobody could guarantee the timing would work. On February 5th and 6th, 1779, roughly 170 men set out on foot toward Vincennes, 200 miles away. Half of them were French volunteers who had sworn loyalty to Clark only months before. Now they were staking their lives on him. Behind them, the whole plan rested on a coincidence nobody could control, whether a small armed boat would find them in a flooded wilderness at all. The weather turned strange almost immediately. Unseasonable warmth melted the winter snow all at once. That meltwater had nowhere to go. It poured into every creek and river until the entire landscape began to disappear underwater. The Wabash River, normally a few hundred feet wide, swelled into a lake nearly 4 miles across. Clark called it simply the drowned country. His men called it something closer to hell. What should have taken 5 or 6 days stretched into 17. 3 of those days were spent wading through water up to their shoulders. The game they relied on for food had fled the flood entirely. There was nothing left to hunt. Men grew weak from hunger and cold. At night, there was often no dry ground at all to lie down on. Clark refused to let despair take hold. He walked among his men constantly, encouraging them, even leading them in song. His second-in-command, Captain Joseph Bowman, kept a journal through it all, a record of a march that seemed to have no end. Even Clark, in his own words, called it a difficult and very fatiguing march. He rarely admitted weakness. This time he did. By February 22nd, they reached the final obstacle, a floodplain that would submerge every man up to his chest. There was no way around it. There was barely a way through it, and there was no turning back now. Clark did the only thing that would move frightened, starving men forward. He went first. He blackened his face with gunpowder, a grim, almost warlike mask, and waded in without hesitation. His men followed him into water that reached their chests, rifles and powder held high above their heads to keep them dry. Some later said it was the hardest single stretch any of them ever survived, in war or otherwise. Some nights, frigid clothes never dried at all. Men slept wet, woke wet, and marched wet again the next morning. It is, by every account, a wonder that not a single man froze to death on that march. The weakest among them began to falter. Clark had the strongest men carry the sick and starving on their shoulders, rather than leave anyone behind. There was no dry firewood most nights. What fires they managed gave more smoke than warmth against the freezing air. Still, Clark pushed them on, mile after freezing mile, because stopping meant dying slowly instead of quickly. They had marched and waded and starved their way across 200 miles of flooded wilderness, and they had made it. Vincennes lay just ahead, but Hamilton had roughly as many defenders inside the fort as Clark had soldiers outside it. A straight fight might have gone either way. So Clark decided not to fight straight at all. He marched his exhausted men in and out of the low hills around the town, again and again, flying every flag they carried. From inside the fort, it looked like an army far larger than the ragged 170 men actually there. The French villagers of Vincennes, already loyal to Clark, quietly supplied his men with dry gunpowder they desperately needed. As night fell, Clark sent word into town, stay indoors. Tonight, he intended to take the fora. His riflemen, frontier marksmen with the best long rifles in North America, took up positions around the fort's walls. When the shooting started, Clark's marksmen picked off defenders through the fort's own gun ports with terrifying accuracy. Inside, Hamilton's men found they couldn't safely man their own cannon. Every gap in the wall drew deadly fire. By morning, Hamilton requested a 3-day truce to consider his position. Clark refused outright. There would be no 3 days. There would be no comfortable surrender on Hamilton's terms. The two commanders agreed to meet face to face in a small village church just outside the fort's walls. During the siege, a party of native warriors allied with the British returning from a raid on Kentucky was captured just outside the fort. What happened next was brutal, deliberate, and meant to break the will of everyone still watching from inside those walls. Clark had most of the prisoners executed in full view of the garrison, a calculated act of psychological warfare on the frontier's terms. It was not an isolated cruelty of the era, it was frontier war. The same brutal logic Hamilton himself had profited from for years.
Clark's written demand to Hamilton left no room for misunderstanding. Surrender now or expect no mercy at all.
Clark spared a young warrior and 2 French partisans that day. It was the only mercy he allowed himself to show. On February 24, 1779, Henry Hamilton, the hair buyer of Detroit, surrendered Fort Sackville to George Rogers Clark. It had taken 19 days, roughly 200 miles, 3 days underwater, and one impossibly stubborn man to make it happen. With Vincennes secured, Clark controlled the entire Illinois country, a territory larger than most European nations. Virginia's claim to the land north of the Ohio River, and by extension, the young United States' claim, now rested on the ground Clark actually held.
4 years later, when diplomats in Paris drew the borders of a new nation, that territory stayed American, largely because Clark never let it go.
Historians would later call him the conqueror of the Old Northwest. He achieved all of it before he turned 30 years old.
General Washington himself noted that Clark had achieved all of it without a single soldier or shilling from the regular Continental Army. For a moment, it seemed like his name would be remembered alongside Washington's.
Virginia owed Clark thousands of pounds for expenses he had personally covered to keep the campaign alive.
The paperwork was mishandled for decades. Some of his vouchers were lost, buried in state archives for over a century. Some of his surviving financial records were destroyed years later, when Benedict Arnold, by then fighting for the British, burned buildings in a raid on Virginia.
After the war, Clark served on commissions negotiating treaties with native nations, including at Fort McIntosh, trying to hold together the peace he had helped create. In 1786, a later expedition against native tribes ended in mutiny. Clark was accused of drunkenness and forced to resign in disgrace.
He demanded a formal investigation to clear his name. It never fully came. He never held military command again.
The years that followed were quiet and hard. Creditors pursued him. He drank more. His fortunes never recovered. In 1809, a stroke left him partially paralyzed. His infected right leg had to be amputated soon after. He moved in with his sister at Locust Grove, Kentucky, unable to care for himself any longer. In 1812, decades too late, Virginia finally granted him a small yearly pension and a ceremonial sword. When he heard that an old friend had died, Clark is said to have remarked bitterly, "Everybody can die but me." On February 13, 1818, after a second stroke, George Rogers Clark died at Locust Grove, Kentucky. He was buried there and later moved to Cave Hill Cemetery in Louisville, a modest grave for a man who once decided the shape of a country.
Clark once waded first into freezing water to save a nation's western border. His own nation never fully paid him back for it.
Today, most Americans have never heard his name. Very few know their western states might not exist without him. If this story moved you, subscribe and let us know in the comments which forgotten founder deserves the next video.